A man disappears in the rain and leaves behind only silence. Welcome to the Whimsy Casebook. I am your host, Morgan Finch. Let's keep this mystery community growing. Drop a comment and share where you're watching from. I always look forward to hearing from each of you. Now, let's begin. It had been raining since dawn. Not a hard, punishing rain, but a quiet drizzle that softened the corners of Paris, turning sharp rooflines to smudges, pooling in cobblestones, and slipping off cafe awnings like someone whispering a secret. Chief Inspector Maigret stood at the window of his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, one hand resting absently on the radiator, though it was June and the heating was long since off. The Seine moved sluggishly below, its slate surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a passing barge. Behind him, the familiar smell of tobacco, damp overcoats, and the faint trace of floor wax lingered in the room. He hadn't lit his pipe yet. It sat on the desk beside the newspaper, half unfolded and unread. The phone was quiet. Maigret had been thinking about Madame Maigret's veal blanquette. She'd packed a portion into a little enameled container for his lunch, which still sat unopened in the desk drawer. They'd eaten it together the night before, with white wine and no conversation after, not out of boredom, just habit, the comfortable kind that doesn't require filling the silences. At 9:15, there had been a small commotion down the corridor, the quick clicking of heels, a voice pitched too high, followed by the soft closing of the commissioner's door. Maigret hadn't stirred. He was used to that rhythm, someone demanding attention, someone upset, someone important, at least to themselves. But his fingers had paused on the cold radiator when he caught a single word from behind the half-closed door. St. Laurent. He didn't know why it caught him. There were dozens of streets like it. But St. Laurent had a smell to it, in his memory of boiled cabbage and burnt milk, of cats on staircases and doors that were always half open. He'd once spent a week there on a missing girl case. It had ended with nothing. The girl had returned on her own, but the street had left its mark. The quiet kind of place that had no business attracting a policeman's attention. He lit his pipe slowly now, tamping the tobacco with the curved side of a matchbox. The first puff brought warmth to the back of his throat. Across the desk, Inspector Janvier looked up from a report but said nothing. "Who was that woman just now?" Maigret asked eventually, without looking at him. Oh. Came in about a tenant. Something about a room on St. Laurent Street. Didn't seem like police business. No, Maigret said, almost to himself. He stood, walked to the coat stand, and began shrugging into his overcoat. It still smelled faintly of the April rain it had absorbed 2 months ago. "I think I'll take a walk." Janvier raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask. Maigret's walks were not uncommon. Sometimes they led to arrests. More often, they led to cafes. The rain had lightened into a mist as he stepped outside. Paris felt muffled, as if wearing a wool coat. He walked slowly, without purpose at first, turning his collar up against the damp, making his way toward the 10th arrondissement, where Rue St. angled itself awkwardly between larger, louder thoroughfares. A street that was always one turn too many, never on the way anywhere. By the time he arrived, his shoes were damp, and the hem of his coat was heavy with water. The street looked just as he remembered. The corner grocer's had a sagging awning. A laundress's shop with a tilted sign adorned the street. Balconies with crooked flower pots, some overgrown, others empty save for a rusting tin can. And quiet. Always quiet. He paused in front of number 36, the kind of building that had once been respectable and had since settled, like old bones, into a sort of benign neglect. He stood there a long time, pipe clenched in his teeth, watching the second-floor window where a lace curtain swayed through the air. Someone had looked down a moment ago. He was sure of it. He saw only a routine, cautious glance, not a sign of interest. Behind him, the door to the tobacconist opened, and a thin man in a black raincoat stepped out with a nod. Maigret returned it, slow and thoughtful. The street smelled the same. He walked back toward the corner cafe, its windows fogged and yellow with light. He didn't know why he was here yet. Only that something, somewhere behind those slicked windows, was out of place. He wasn't in error, at least not yet. Just slightly out of step. He ordered a beer. Not because he was thirsty, but because it gave him a reason to sit, to stay, to wait. The woman who had visited the station, he would learn later, was called Madame Fevre, widow. Quiet. She had rented a room to a man who had not been seen in 3 days. She wasn't worried, she'd said. Just uncertain. Something about the smell, not quite gas, not quite death. Something else. But Maigret didn't know that yet. He sipped his beer and looked out at the drizzle. He would wait a little while longer. The street would tell him. It always did. The rain had not stopped, though it had turned more insistent, tapping now on the cafe windows like impatient fingers. Maigret sat with his elbows resting on the sticky wood table, his overcoat draped behind him on the chair. A thin wisp of steam rose from the collar, and his damp trousers clung faintly to his knees. He was used to discomfort, and didn't mind waiting, least of all in places like this small anonymous cafe, where the coffee came bitter and quick, and the patrons spoke softly, if at all. Across from him, behind the counter, a woman in her 50s wiped glasses with mechanical movements. Her face was drawn, not unfriendly, just worn by years of oil smoke and cigarette ash. Maigret had already drawn a little sketch of her character in his mind. A widow, perhaps, or married to a husband who spent more time across the street at the horse betting kiosk than at home. She gave him a glance from time to time, but not out of curiosity. She had seen men like him before. He didn't drink the beer right away. The glass sat half full, the foam gone. It was just an anchor, a reason to occupy space. Through the window, number 36 Rue St. looked the same as ever, 3 floors peeling paint, and a narrow entryway with a doorbell panel too large for the number of tenants. The window with the half curtain remained still, but he hadn't forgotten the fleeting glance earlier. Maigret knew he could walk over, ring the bell, announce himself as Chief Inspector Maigret of the Police Judiciaire, and ask a dozen questions. But it wasn't time. The street wasn't ready to answer yet. Instead, he lit his pipe. The first few puffs crackled in the bowl. He felt the warmth settle inside his chest. The cafe woman approached. "Another beer?" she asked, not quite looking at him. He shook his head. "You know the building across the way?" he asked mildly, his voice calm, almost absent. She gave a shrug. "People come and go. A bit quieter than some of the others around here. Fewer arguments, at least. Do you ever see the man in the second-floor room?" Her eyes moved quickly, just for a second, toward the window he meant. "There's always someone in that room," she said. "Quiet fellow. Doesn't make trouble." Maigret nodded and took a slow sip. "Renters, are they?" "Furnished rooms," she said, shifting the weight of her hip. "Madame Fevre's the one who lets them out. Keeps to herself mostly. Been here forever. Bit odd, if you ask me." "In what way?" "Not much of a talker. Not cold, just private. You get a feeling sometimes, you know. People who live behind curtains." Maigret smiled faintly. He understood what she meant. "And the middle-aged? Not young. Looks like a clerk. He always wore the same brown coat, with the elbows going thin. Carried a briefcase, but I doubt it had anything important in it." "Has he been around lately?" She considered that. "Not for a few days, but that's not so strange. Some of them go off without saying. Come back with a suitcase and a cough." Maigret's expression didn't change, but something had landed. something small but real. He stood slowly, thanked her with a nod, and stepped back out into the rain. The cold hit him again, soaked deeper now, as if testing his resolve. He crossed the street without hurry, his pipe still clutched between his fingers, though it had gone out. The entryway of number 36 was dim. Inside, the linoleum had peeled up in the corners and smelled faintly of vinegar and cat urine. A bank of letterboxes lined one wall, each with a different name scrawled in pencil or not at all. He pressed the button labeled Fevre 2E. A buzz, then silence. He waited. Then a faint shuffling sound behind the door. It opened a crack. She was exactly as he expected her to be. Small, with silver hair pulled back tightly, eyes behind square spectacles, not timid, but self-contained, like someone who lived entirely inside her own habits. "Yes, Madame Fevre?" he asked gently. "Yes, I'm Chief Inspector Maigret. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if I may, about the man in your second-floor room." She hesitated, but only for a second. Then she stepped back, and he entered. The hallway was narrow. A Persian runner covered the center of the floor, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. On a small table near the stairs, a ceramic bowl held old keys and a matchbook. "You'd better come up," she said. He followed her, slowly, the stairs creaking under his weight. The second floor opened into a short corridor. She gestured toward a door at the end. "That's his room." "Name?" He gave it as René Chabot. He said he worked in insurance. "Is he still here?" She hesitated. "I don't know. That's what I came to tell the police. I haven't seen him since Monday, and now there's a smell." Maigret looked at her. She avoided his gaze. "What kind of smell?" "Hard to say. Not like gas, not like something rotten either, just something that shouldn't be." He stepped past her and gently tried the door. It was locked. "You have a key?" "Yes." She fished it from her cardigan pocket and passed it to him with 2 fingers. He took it without comment and inserted it into the lock. It turned stiffly. The door creaked open. He didn't step inside right away. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. The air was stale. Not unbearable, but dense, with the faint sour tang of something neglected. Maigret stepped in slowly. It was a small room, barely enough for the single bed, a wardrobe, and a desk. The bed was made, not precisely, but recently. A newspaper lay folded on the desk, Tuesday's edition. He crossed to the pulled-back curtain. Grey light flooded in, showing dust motes floating like tiny ghosts. No one was in the room. There was no sign of violence, no overturned furniture, and no broken glass. But something was missing. Maigret turned to Madame Fevre. "Did he leave anything behind?" She pursed her lips. "I haven't touched a thing." He moved to the wardrobe. Inside were a few shirts, 2 neckties, and a pair of shoes. The brown overcoat hung at the far end, sleeves limp. On the dresser, a shaving brush and a toothbrush still damp at the base. But the briefcase mentioned by the cafe woman was gone. He turned back to Madame Fevre. "When was the last time you saw him?" "Monday morning, around 8. He was coming down the stairs, nodded to me, said nothing. That was it. And after that, no one's been in or out of the room, not that I've seen." Maigret nodded. He stepped back out into the corridor. The rain pressed faintly against the window panes, a steady, unbroken sound. Madame Fevre followed him to the landing. "Do you think something's wrong, Inspector?" He didn't answer right away. At the top of the stairs, he paused, looking back toward the half-lit hallway and the closed door to Chabot's room. "Sometimes people leave," he said, "but they don't take the toothbrush." He thanked her quietly and descended the stairs. Outside, the rain had picked up again, as if Paris itself were unwilling to reveal more. He stood in the doorway, a long time before lighting his pipe once more, and turning toward the police van parked 2 streets over. Not because of anything said, but because of what wasn't. The grey of the Paris sky had deepened by the time Margaret returned to Rue St. Laurent the next morning. The rain had not ceased, it rarely did in June. It was not quite summer, and not still spring, that narrow, uneasy space in the seasons when the air hung damp and the buildings seemed to lean inward with fatigue. He walked slowly from the metro station, taking in the street with a gaze not quite focused but far from indifferent. His pipe was unlit, his hat pushed low to shield his eyes. There was a quietness to the street, not of silence, but of daily routine. Bakers preparing rolls behind frosted glass, a boy pushing a cart of coal, and the echo of footsteps on wet stone. He passed the cafe from the day before, and caught the cafe woman's eye through the misted window. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging that the matter was not yet finished. Inside number 36, the hallway still smelled of vinegar and old paper. Margaret climbed the stairs slowly, each creak underfoot like a question waiting to be answered. On the landing, the door to René Chabot's room remained closed. He did not need to open it again. He had seen what it wanted to show him. Now it was time to see what the others would reveal to those who lived not inside the room but around it. He knocked on the door opposite. A moment passed, then another. The door opened just a crack. It was a man in a vest, shirt sleeves rolled up, spectacles perched at the end of his nose. A shaving brush still foamed in one hand. "Yes, Margaret. Police Judiciaire. May I come in?" The man blinked, gave a cautious nod, and stepped aside. Margaret entered. The room was not much different from Chabot's, slightly larger perhaps, but furnished in the same utilitarian style. A small table by the window, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed. On the windowsill sat a potted plant, too dry to be thriving. "I won't take much of your time," Margaret said. The man wiped his hands on a towel and motioned toward one of the chairs. "Please, I'm Armand Ducos, school teacher. Mathematics." Margaret sat but did not remove his coat. His eyes drifted over the room. "You knew your neighbor, Monsieur Chabot." Ducos nodded, but there was hesitation in the gesture. "In passing, we nodded, said good morning. I believe he worked in insurance. Quiet man. Did you hear anything from his room Monday morning? Anything unusual?" Ducos gave the question the kind of thought a school teacher might, careful and methodical. "No, not unusual. But then again, I leave early. I teach at Lycée Buffon. I would have gone out before 8. Margaret nodded. That aligned with Madame Fevre's statement. He didn't mention any plans. No conversation in the days before. Ducos gave a small, apologetic smile. "I wouldn't say we were friends, Inspector. I always had the impression he kept to himself by design." Margaret tapped the bowl of his pipe softly against the edge of the chair. "Did he ever receive visitors?" "No," said Ducos, without hesitation. "At least not while I was home. He never made noise. I sometimes wondered if he ever turned the radio on." Margaret looked again toward the window, the view it offered of the building's modest courtyard below. "Do you know if he had any personal troubles? Debts, arguments, that sort of thing?" "No arguments, and he never seemed the type for debts. Rather too modest in his habits." Margaret stood, his eyes lingering for a moment on the shaving brush, the slow drip of lather onto the rim of the basin. "I may have more questions later, Monsieur Ducos. For now, thank you." The man nodded, relieved, and showed him to the door. Margaret crossed the landing and climbed to the 3rd floor. He knocked at another door. A child's cry sounded behind it, followed by a mother's shushing voice. After a few moments, the door opened, revealing a young woman with tired eyes and a child balanced on one hip. "Yes, I'm sorry to trouble you." "Chief Inspector Margaret, May I come in for just a few? She glanced behind her into the room, then stepped aside without speaking. The child clung to her neck. Inside, the room was crowded with furniture too large for the space, an armoire, a battered crib, and a hot plate perched on a stool. The air was thick with the smell of milk and cabbage. "You live here with your husband?" Margaret asked. "He's on the night shift." "Street cleaning," she said. "I'm Helene Martin." Margaret nodded. "And you've been here long?" "5 months. Since our last place flooded. This building, well, it's not much, but Madame Fevre is kind enough." He smiled gently. "I'd like to ask about your neighbor on the 2nd floor, Monsieur Chabot." She looked uncertain. "I don't know him, not really. He was always polite. Kept to himself." "Do you ever see anyone visiting him?" She shook her head. "No. I mean, I don't watch, but the stairs creak. I would have heard. Besides Madame Fevre when she changes the linens, no one else. Any noises from his room, quarrels, music, anything?" She looked down at her child. "Sometimes I don't know. Maybe I imagined it. Once or twice in the evening, I thought I heard him speaking. Not loud, just low, like someone on the telephone. But I never saw a wire. No telephone line up there." That gave Margaret pause. He made no sign. "Do you remember when you last saw him?" "Sunday, late afternoon. He was leaving the building. Same coat, same little case." He didn't look up. "Did you see him return?" She shook her head. "No, but with the baby, I go to bed early." Margaret gave a polite nod. "Thank you, Madame Martin. You've been helpful." He stepped out again onto the narrow landing, pausing briefly to take in the sounds of the dripping faucets, a radio far below, and the occasional footfall muffled by the rain. He descended the stairs slowly and paused in the entryway. The pattern was forming, faint but real. A man who kept no friends left no trace, except the toothbrush. And a voice was overheard. Speaking to no one, he stepped back into the street and made his way to the cafe. Inside, the light was warm. The woman behind the counter raised an eyebrow. "Back already?" Margaret nodded and took his seat by the window. "Coffee this time?" She brought it without a word. "Did you ever see him with anyone?" he asked, once she returned. She leaned on the counter though. "Now that you mention it, maybe once, some weeks ago. A younger man, I remember because they didn't sit, they stood out there in the rain, talking. Arguing a little, maybe. Do you remember his face?" She shook her head. "Dark coat. That's all I saw. Could have been a nephew. Could have been a bill collector." Margaret took a long sip of his coffee. Outside, the rain showed no sign of stopping. Across the street, the 2nd floor window remained still. There was no crime yet. Nobody, no certainty. But something was off. And Margaret, feeling the weight of it in his bones, knew that the next step would not come from deduction, but from the slow, patient peeling away of silences. He would begin at the Ministry of Insurance records, and he would ask for René Chabot. Margaret never liked official buildings. The Ministry of Insurance records was no exception. A high-ceilinged corridor, with faded stencils along the plaster walls, the stale scent of carbon paper and polished linoleum, and voices that echoed too much for how softly they were spoken. The receptionist was young, with her hair was tied back in a bun so tight it seemed to pull at her eyebrows. She looked up from a stack of forms, and gave Margaret the glance of someone not quite expecting to deal with real police. He showed his identification without flourish, offering his name in a voice that suggested he wasn't in a hurry. Still, something in his tone made her rise from her seat more quickly than she might have for anyone else. "A moment, Inspector. I'll find the registrar." He nodded, and sat on the hard wooden bench opposite the window. The rain had followed him even here. It tapped against the high panes with the same measured persistence. A janitor passed down the corridor, pushing a squeaky cart, and the faint smell of ammonia floated behind him. Within a few minutes, a thin man with rimless glasses and a grey suit appeared. He looked exactly like someone who spent his life inside folders. He offered a dry hand. Jacques Colbin, senior archivist.
You're here about René Chabot, I understand. Maigret stood. Yes, he gave up his occupation as an insurance clerk. I was hoping to confirm whether he was employed here or with one of your affiliate bureaus. Certainly. Come with me. They walked together through a labyrinth of offices, past typists bent over their machines, rooms full of filing cabinets, and walls covered with years of dust-dulled posters on pension plans and accident claims. Finally, they reached a smaller room lined with bookshelves and a central desk piled with narrow folders secured by string. Colbin opened a drawer, leafed through index cards, and selected one with delicate fingers. Chabot, René, he read. Yes. Registered 3 years ago with Dufresne and Morel, a private firm but part of our network. We provide their central indexing. He handed the card to Maigret, who read the neat type, Chabot, René, Dufresne and Morel. Claims administration, employment start date, the 17th of January, 1952. Last activity recorded, the 27th of May, 1955. Maigret looked up. Last activity was Friday of last, yes, a claim review. The next appointment was listed for Monday, but the man hesitated. Looking down at the card again, he did not appear. It was marked as a no-show. Did they report his absence? Colbin gave a small, apologetic smile. I'm afraid not. We don't involve ourselves unless there's an audit. Absenteeism is a matter for the individual firms. Maigret nodded. He expected as much. Can I see his personnel file? I can request it from the firm. That would take a day or two. We don't keep copies here. Maigret handed the card back and thanked the man. As he retraced his steps through the ministry's narrow halls, a low rumble of doubt began to stir inside him, not loud, not urgent, but persistent, like the weather. Something was wrong, not in what Chabot had done, but in what he had not done. A man as regular as clockwork doesn't simply vanish between appointments, leaving behind his toothbrush and his shaving brush still wet. Back outside, Maigret lit his pipe beneath the canopy, shielding the flame with his palm. The rain continued its silent work over the streets, rinsing away footprints before they had a chance to dry. Instead of returning to St. Laurent Street, he walked, not toward anything, but away from the ministry, letting the rhythm of the street speak to him. He stopped in a tabac on Boulevard de Magenta to buy a fresh pouch of tobacco, and passed a small newsstand where the morning headlines spoke of strikes, elections, and a woman who had given birth in the back of a taxi. No mention of Chabot. No one missed him. Not officially. At the corner of Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis, Maigret paused under the dripping eaves of a baker's shop. The smell of yeast and warm sugar drifted through the glass, but he didn't go in. He was thinking about the brown overcoat, hanging limply in the wardrobe. Chabot had left it behind. Yet the cafe woman had seen him wearing it during his last conversation with the unknown man in the rain. Unless that conversation hadn't been recent, or unless the overcoat, now hanging in the room, wasn't the only one he owned. He turned and walked back toward the arrondissement. The streets were familiar to him. Rue du Château d'Eau and Rue Lucien Sampé are quiet arteries feeding the life of the city. He stopped once at a small newspaper archive near the Conservatoire, where a friend of his, an old journalist named Truffaut, ran the back room. Over coffee, they flipped through recent death notices, missing persons reports, and unclaimed hospital admissions. Nothing. No mention of a Chabot, René. Maigret stood again, feeling the weight of the coffee in his stomach. I've got a name that isn't floating. he said quietly. And that usually means it's anchored to something heavier. Back on Rue St. Laurent, the drizzle had turned into a curtain. The windows of number 36 wept tiny rivers down their panes. Maigret didn't go in. He walked instead to the corner bakery, where an elderly woman was brushing down the counter with slow, deliberate strokes. "Good morning," Maigret said, removing his hat. She looked up. "Morning. I'm sorry to intrude. I'm making inquiries about one of your neighbors, René Chabot." She gave a thoughtful look, setting her cloth aside. "Second floor. Yes. He came in on Sundays, bought brioche, always exact change. Quiet man. Never smiled, but not rude. You remember him from this past Sunday?" The woman hesitated. "I do. Because he bought 2 brioche rolls, not 1. Maigret felt a small shift inside. "Did he say why?" "No. Just that he'd need another one. First time in months. And you haven't seen him since." She shook her head. He thanked her and stepped back into the rain. The scent of warm bread followed him into the street. 2 rolls. Maigret returned to the cafe. The woman behind the bar greeted him with a glance that bordered on expectation. "I found out more about your man," she said before he could sit. "Go on." "He used to go to the post office every Tuesday, always just after lunch. I noticed it because it was like clockwork, but this week, nothing." Maigret nodded. "Thank you." He sat, ordered a beer, and watched the water trace its way down the glass. The picture was becoming clearer, but only in the way fog sometimes lifted from a mirror. A man who changed nothing about his life until something, or someone, made him change a habit. Buy 2 rolls, speak in the room, miss an appointment. There was still no evidence of crime, but there was a hole where Chabot had been. And Maigret could feel the cold of it now, not from the rain, but from the quiet that follows after a decision has been made and before its consequences arrive. The rain had lessened by the time Maigret returned home, though the streets still glistened like wet slate under the weak glow of street lamps. It was nearly 8. He entered the apartment quietly, as he often did, more like someone slipping into a familiar book than returning from an investigation. The hallway was dim. Madame Maigret had left the light on in the kitchen, and the smell of something simple, leek soup, he guessed, still lingered in the warm air. She was at the sink when he appeared, her hands in the dishwater, sleeves rolled up, a checked apron tied neatly around her waist. She looked over her shoulder, unsurprised. "You're late," she said without reprimand. Maigret removed his coat, hung it by the door, and set his hat gently on the side table. His shoes made a soft squelch as he stepped across the linoleum. "It wasn't urgent work," he said, his voice low, tired but untroubled. "Just something odd." He kissed her cheek and sat down at the small table near the window. The window was cracked open a centimeter for the steam to escape, and the sound of light rain brushing the leaves of the courtyard tree came in, soothing in its monotony. Madame Maigret returned to the stove, filled a bowl from the pot, and placed it before him along with a thick slice of bread and a square of butter wrapped in its paper. She didn't press him for details. She rarely did. He began to eat, slowly, methodically, grateful for the heat and salt. She returned to the sink. After a while, he said, "There's a man missing, name of René Chabot. Second floor room in a building on Rue St. Laurent. Not officially missing. Not yet, but something's off." She glanced at him. "What do you mean?" He spooned up the last of the broth and set the spoon down gently. He left behind his coat and his toothbrush, but not his briefcase. "That sounds like someone planning to return," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. Maigret nodded. "Unless he didn't expect to leave at all." She poured herself a cup of chicory coffee and sat across from him. "Did he live alone?" "Yes. Quiet man. Polite, didn't draw attention. But this passed the office. We bought 2 brochures instead of 1. Someone saw him talking to a younger man in the office. A few evenings before, a neighbor heard him speaking alone in his room. No telephone. Was he in trouble? Doesn't look like it, but he missed work Monday. Never showed. Madame Maigret leaned her chin into her palm. Did anyone care that he was gone? Maigret raised his eyebrows slightly. Not really. Not until Madame Fèvre came to the station. She said, there was a smell. Madame Maigret frowned slightly. Poor woman. Maigret didn't answer. He reached for the crust of bread and buttered it slowly. She sipped her coffee. After a while, she said, it reminds me of that woman who lived on Rue St, the one who disappeared, but had mailed her rent for 3 months after. That was different, Maigret said. She'd run off. Started over in Marseille, found a new name. I spoke to her in a boarding house and never looked back. Madame Maigret watched him for a moment, then added quietly, but he didn't start over, did he? This is Chabot. He just stopped. Maigret looked at her. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it, with that quiet certainty women often have when they've seen 1,000 small human moments add up to something larger. Chabot didn't flee. He wasn't swept away by passion or desperation. He had simply stopped being part of his own story. She stood, rinsed her cup and added, you know, sometimes it's not the event that matters, it's the preparation. The little changes, buying an extra brooch, not shaving properly, speaking aloud to an empty room. People rehearse their exits before they leave. Maigret sat back, watching her. He thought about the brown overcoat, the folded newspaper on the desk, the single dry towel in the washroom, and the small, almost imperceptible shift in routine. You think he planned it, he said. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. After she had gone to bed, Maigret sat in the kitchen a while longer. He lit his pipe and let the smoke drift toward the open window. The rain had stopped entirely now. The courtyard tree was still. The next morning, he returned to Rue St. Laurent early. The air was clear but heavy with the smell of wet stone and morning dew. The street was just beginning to wake up. Shop shutters rattling open, the sound of water being thrown across cobblestones, and a delivery cart clattering in the distance. He entered number 36 without speaking to Madame Fèvre. She didn't appear anyway. He walked past Chabot's room and knocked on the door opposite. Armand Ducos answered again, surprised but composed. I've remembered something. Maigret said simply, I thought you might help. Ducos stepped aside, clearly curious. Maigret entered and glanced around the room. It was cleaner than before. The shaving brush was gone from the basin. Did Chabot ever speak about leaving Paris? He asked. Never, said Ducos. He wasn't the sort. He seemed rooted. You know the type. Maigret nodded slowly. And the briefcase, did you ever see it open? Ducos hesitated. Once in the stairwell. I came in behind him, and he was trying to find something. Papers, perhaps. Anything with names. No, just envelopes. Blank. Maigret studied him. And the man he spoke with in the rain, you saw him. I did, Ducos admitted. But I didn't want to mention it before. I thought it was personal. Why? They argued. Not loudly, but their gestures are tight and fast. The younger man seemed frustrated. Chabot, he looked tired. Did you hear anything they said? Ducos shook his head. Maigret looked out the window. The street below was beginning to stir properly now. A child ran past with a satchel swinging. Someone was lighting a cigarette in the doorway across the street. I don't think Chabot was afraid, Maigret said. But I think he was preparing. For what? Maigret didn't answer. Not yet, but Madame Maigret's words lingered in his mind.
Not the event, the rehearsal. He needed to know what was in the briefcase, or what had been taken from it. The sky had darkened again by mid-afternoon, heavy with more rain. The light filtering down Rue St. Laurent was the color of old tin, and everything beneath it seemed dulled. The stone, the windows, even the occasional passerby with their collars turned up, and their heads bent low. It was a city holding its breath, though Maigret knew the city never truly stopped, only slowed to a murmur. He stood beneath the awning of the cafe once more, letting the last of his pipe's warmth linger in his chest. The same woman worked behind the counter, polishing glasses with her usual indifferent rhythm. She gave him a small nod as he entered, one that said, "Still not finished." Then, Maigret returned the nod and sat at the same table as before, the one near the window, from which he could watch the second-floor window of number 36. Still no movement behind the lace curtain. He ordered coffee this time, strong and black, more out of habit than desire. The rain began again, a thin whisper on the glass. As he stirred the cup, he saw her. Madame Fevre, emerging from the front door of her building, was wrapped tightly in a dark shawl, her hair pinned back with precise care. She walked carefully, as if measuring each step, and her eyes darted quickly across the street before settling on the cafe. Her lips pursed at the sight of Maigret, but she crossed nonetheless, entered with the soft chime of the doorbell, and stood by the counter. "I'll have a tisane," she said to the woman behind the bar, barely glancing at Maigret. He didn't look at her right away. He let her sit first, 3 stools away, let her remove her gloves finger by finger, and smooth the napkin across her lap. He only spoke once her tea had arrived. "You're troubled, Madame Fevre." Her spoon clinked against the cup. She gave a soft, dry laugh. "I suppose everyone on this street is in some way. You spend enough time alone, and even the quiet becomes suspicious." Maigret turned slightly in his seat, watching her with mild eyes. "But you're not everyone. You came to the station, you reported something no one else even noticed." "I smelled something strange," she said flatly. "You said it wasn't gas, or rot, something else, something that disturbed you." Her eyes stayed on the tea. "Yes." He waited, letting the silence widen around them. Outside the rain picked up again. Drops raced each other down the glass, leaving narrow, glistening paths. "I've seen people vanish before," she said quietly. "Rumors, tenants, most of them leave without a word. The police never come. But this one was different." She raised her eyes now, and there was something brittle in them. "I went into his room." Maigret nodded slightly, though he didn't move. "When?" "Tuesday, after he missed the rent. I have a master key. I always wait until they're late. He was never late." "What did you see?" She hesitated and looked down again. Everything looked the same. The bed was made. His coat was gone. But I knew he hadn't really left. The air felt wrong. "You touched something." I opened the wardrobe. His overcoat was still there. Another one. But the briefcase was missing, and on the desk, she stopped. Maigret waited. "A letter," she said finally. "Not addressed, but written. Half a page. Did you read it?" "Of course I did." Her voice broke slightly. "How could I not? I live alone. That's not an excuse, but it's the truth." "I read it." He didn't admonish her. He knew already. "What did it say?" She closed her eyes briefly, recalling it. "I am not the man they believe me to be." That was the first line, and then something about having failed to put things right, that he had waited too long, and that it wasn't courage he lacked, but understanding. Her voice had grown thinner. There was no signature. "What did you do with the letter?" She swallowed. "I burned it." Maigret said nothing. She continued, quietly. "I told myself it was shame, his shame, that it wasn't for anyone else. But I also told myself that I didn't want anyone to think I'd known more than I did, that I'd done something wrong by reading it. It was fear, I suppose. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the tea to her lips. The cup clinked gently against the saucer as she set it back down. "There's something else," she said, almost a whisper. Margaret nodded once, encouraging. "That Sunday night, I heard voices. Not loud, just murmuring. I live just below, you understand. I don't sleep well. The floorboards speak." He smiled faintly. "Yes, they do. It wasn't an argument," she said. "But it wasn't pleasant. Two voices. One of them was his. The other young. Very young." She paused. Then a silence, for a long time. And the next morning, he was gone. Margaret looked down at the coffee cooling in his cup. "You said earlier that he was quiet, that he didn't draw attention. But you also noticed him. You watched him." She looked at him, and for the first time her eyes filled slightly, the gloss of emotion finally surfacing after days of restraint. "I live alone, Inspector. For 22 years now. The people in that house come and go. They bring noise, mess, and sometimes joy, but mostly they bring forgetting. And he didn't forget things. He polished his shoes every Thursday. He cleaned his sink after every shave. He made the bed neatly, even on Sundays. People like that stand out, even when they try not to. And you grew fond of him." She nodded slowly, then added, "In a way I wouldn't have admitted. It wasn't affection exactly. But he made the building feel steady. Do you understand?" "I do," Margaret said. They sat for a moment longer, the rain muting the street outside. "I should have told you everything," she whispered. "But I was ashamed. I thought, if he meant to disappear, then it was his right. But now I think—" Her voice broke. "I think he wanted someone to stop him." Margaret rose gently, not abruptly. He left coins for both their drinks, and stood beside her for a moment. "You've helped more than you know," he said softly. Outside, the rain was beginning to let up again. A streetcar passed at the far end of the road, the low rumble of its wheels echoing off the wet walls. Margaret lit his pipe and turned once more to look at the second-floor window. Now it looked different to him, not because anything had changed, but because someone had finally looked too closely and seen what they were afraid to see. He crossed back to number 36. This time, he went directly to Chabot's room and let himself in. The air was still thick, not foul, but settled, as if the room had finally accepted the absence of its tenant. He looked at the desk again. There was no letter now, no envelope, only the folded newspaper, untouched, from the previous week. But in the wastebasket, buried under crumpled tissues and a torn shirt collar, he found something, the stub of a telegram form. Only one line remained legible in blue ink. "Arriving Sunday. Must talk. P." Margaret held it in his hand, feeling the dampness of paper that had once meant something and now held the key to someone's undoing. He would find out who P was and why Chabot had been afraid not of violence, but of truth. It was the kind of quiet Thursday afternoon that felt as though it had slipped unnoticed between the pages of the calendar. The rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low and sullen above the rooftops. The street glistened not with freshness, but with that perpetual damp that Paris carries in its bones, particularly in streets like Rue St. Laurent, which never dried entirely, no matter the season. Margaret sat at his desk in the Quai des Orfèvres, the stub of the telegram on the blotter before him. He stared at the ink, faded at the edges from having been buried beneath other things, other distractions. But the handwriting was distinct. Firm strokes. Male. Likely young, but deliberate. The sender had signed only with a letter P. Not an uncommon initial, but it was enough to begin with. He reached for the telephone
and called Janvier, who was out following up on another matter. Then he placed a call to the Central Post and Telegram office at Rue de Louvre. "Could you check your dispatch logs for any telegrams sent to or from René Chabot within the past week?" he asked. The clerk on the other end was obliging in the way long-time civil servants often were with Maigret, equal parts curiosity and deference. After a moment, there was the sound of fingers thumbing through a ledger. "Yes, there's a record," the clerk said. "One telegram, received by Chabot on Saturday evening. Sent from a bureau in Lire. Short message. The sender signed P." Maigret leaned forward. "Can you read the content of the telegram?" A pause, a rustling of paper. "Arriving Sunday. Must talk. That's it." Maigret thanked him and hung up. Lire. It fits the mood of the message, urgent, but not threatening. The sort of message sent by someone with unfinished business, someone who had thought too long before reaching out and decided, at last, to speak in person. He sent a wire to the Lyon Bureau with a copy of the message, requesting a trace on the sender. While waiting for a reply, he stepped outside for a walk, his coat folded over one arm and pipe clenched unlit in his teeth. The city had that sheen of pause again, with traffic quieter, and the air dense but still. He walked without urgency toward the Simenon, stopping once for a glass of beer at a cafe he hadn't visited in years. The barman was different, younger, but the stools were the same. He sat and watched people pass, wondering as he often did, how many of them carried burdens they would never speak of, little failures, brief acts of cowardice, quiet disappearances. By the time he returned to the office, a telegram reply awaited him. The sender was identified as Paul Chabot, 26, residing in Lire, Rue des Mariniers. No criminal record. Civil servant. Related to the subject, René Chabot is believed to be the nephew. Local contact confirmed train arrival in Paris Sunday morning, and returned the same. Maigret read it slowly. Paul Chabot. It was a name that felt both natural and uncomfortable. Family. A blood tie. But not a close one. Nephews live their own lives, unless they are called upon. He placed a call to Lire, and requested Paul Chabot's home number. After a short delay, the line was patched through. The phone rang 4 times before a voice answered, young but cautious. "Yes, Paul Chabot. Yes, this is Chief Inspector Maigret, from the Police Judiciaire in Paris." A pause, a breath was caught. "Yes," the voice said again, more guarded now. "I believe you visited your uncle René this past Sunday. May I ask how that visit went?" Another pause, longer this time. "Then I'm not sure how to answer that, Inspector. I'd prefer the truth." There was the sound of a chair scraping the floor. "I suppose I knew this might come. May I ask, is he all right?" Maigret let the silence answer that for him. And after a moment, the voice on the line said quieter, "I thought so. Why did you come to see him?" "He sent for me," Paul said. "Not directly, but through my mother. She passed away 6 months ago. He didn't attend the funeral. Didn't write. But last month, I received a letter from him. He said he wanted to talk about things left undone. Regrets, that sort of language. Did he tell you what he, not over the letter? That's why I came. I thought he might be ill." "And was he?" "In a way," Paul said. "But not in the way I expected." Maigret sat back in his chair, pipe forgotten. "Go on." "When I arrived, he greeted me like I was a stranger. Polite, distant. He said he had something to confess, but not to me as a person. More to the idea of me. Of youth, maybe." He spoke in circles for a while. "About what?" "About decisions. About silence. About the way one can let a lie grow until it covers everything else." He told me he had once caused harm, not by action, but by omission. Maigret waited. He didn't say what it was, only that he had not stepped in when he could have, that someone had suffered because he remained quiet, that he had lived with it for too long. Did he name the person? The victim? No. He only said he had come to believe that guilt could be inherited, that perhaps I had a right to know what kind of man he really was. And then Paul sighed. Then he stopped speaking. Just like that, as if the energy had drained from him. He looked empty. He said I should go, that he had done what he set out to do. You left that evening?
Yes.
I took the 8 o'clock train back to Lyre. Did you see him again?
No.
Maigret tapped the desk with his fingers. One last question, Paul. Was there any mention of death? There was a beat of silence on the line. No, but I think he knew he would disappear. Maigret thanked him and hung up the receiver slowly. He returned to Rue St. Laurent late that afternoon. The clouds had broken enough for a weak sun to lay a pale sheet of light across the facade of number 36. He stood on the opposite side of the street, watching the second-floor window. René Chabot had not vanished out of fear, nor from shame.
Not in the conventional sense. He had waited too long to unburden himself, and in the end he had chosen silence over confrontation. But he had wanted someone to see, to listen. He had burned the letter but left the room in order, left his toothbrush, bought 2 brioches, called his nephew. A rehearsal, as Madame Maigret had said. Maigret turned and walked slowly back toward the Quai des Orfèvres. He would not file charges. There was no crime. Nobody. Only a quiet man who had lived too long inside a silence of his own making, and who, in the end, had tried to speak too softly, too late, but it had been heard. And that, Maigret thought, might have been enough for him. The next morning Maigret rose earlier than usual. There was no pressing case, no summons from the commissioner's office, and no anxious telephone calls rattling his morning routine. But something in him refused to sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with a soft crust of bread and strong coffee, both taken slowly, the way one might read an old letter aloud to no one. Madame Maigret had gone to the market just after 7, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and starch, and the quiet familiarity of her absence filled the flat. On the windowsill, the geraniums she tended so faithfully leaned slightly toward the dim grey light of the courtyard. They were healthy, as usual, but still bent, as if listening. He smoked his pipe, not for pleasure, but for rhythm. The investigation into René Chabot, if one could even call it that, had concluded without any formal conclusion. No crime, no charges, no death certificate. Only a space where a man had been, and which now stood hollow, quietly echoing with the words he had been too late in saying. The paperwork would be minimal. A short note in the daily report, subject presumed missing, no foul play suspected. Known associates made contact, psychological factors indicated. Janvier would ask what it meant in practice, and Maigret would shrug, not indifferently, but in acknowledgement, that sometimes the truth resided in places no file could reach. By mid-morning, he made his way on foot back to Rue St. Laurent. The rain had held off for once, though the sky still wore its usual frown. Patches of light flickered across puddles and slate rooftops, but never long enough to warm anything. The street seemed quieter than before, or perhaps more aware of being watched. At the far end, the same boy from earlier in the week, perhaps 10 or 11, kicked a flat stone along the curb. He looked up briefly as Maigret passed, then returned to his game without a word. The door to number 36 opened before Maigret could reach for the bell. It was Madame Fèvre. She stood in the doorway, cardigan wrapped tightly over her shoulders, her face composed but tired in the way only honesty can make a person tired. "I wondered if you would come back," she said softly. "I wanted to ask about the room." She stepped aside to let him in. Her slippers whispered against the hallway floor as she led him upstairs. "I haven't touched it since," she said, as they reached the second floor. "Not even the bed." The door opened with the same slight resistance. Margaret stepped inside. Nothing had changed. The curtains hung stiff and unmoved. The small desk still bore the same newspaper, the same faint ring of moisture from a long-finished glass. The scent had faded. Whatever strange clawing note she had smelled earlier in the week was now gone. What remained was only dust and the stillness of absence. "He left something behind," Madame Fèvre said, behind him. She moved to the wardrobe and reached up to a narrow shelf. From it, she pulled down a thin envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she passed it to him. "I didn't open it. Not this one. It was slipped inside a book. I only found it last night." Margaret turned the envelope over. It was unsealed. No address, just the same confident, measured handwriting. "For the one who listens." He opened it carefully. Inside, a single page. "I have lived as if silence could undo what action once failed to stop. But silence never clears the debt. It only delays the moment when someone else must carry it forward. If you are reading this, then you have found what remains. I ask for no judgment, only that someone understands that there was, at least, an attempt." Margaret folded the letter slowly. He did not react outwardly, nor did he ask who it was meant for. That much was clear. It was not a confession. It was an offering. A small, incomplete gesture left behind like an unlit lamp on a table, one no longer needed by the man who placed it there. He left Madame Fèvre in the hallway and made his way back down the stairs. She didn't follow him, nor did she need to. Some understandings require no summary. The echo of his steps on the wooden stairs seemed to absorb the room's last secret. Outside, the clouds were beginning to break slightly, allowing a thread of light to stitch its way along the rooftops. It would not last. Rain was forecast again by evening, but for the moment the city exhaled. He turned into the narrow alley behind the street, where the rear windows of number 36 looked out onto damp laundry lines and an unused water pump. He lit his pipe again and stood there watching the backs of the lives he had briefly stepped into. Paul Chabot had done what he could. So had Madame Fèvre, and so in his own final way, had René. Margaret thought of the boy playing in the street, the cafe woman drying glasses, and the baker folding parchment over warm loaves. Life would go on without noticing that something had slipped loose and disappeared. Not a man, exactly. More a silence that had for a time held its shape. He found himself an hour later, sitting once again at the cafe. The woman behind the bar said nothing. She brought him his usual, and he nodded in thanks. The table by the window was dry now. Someone had cleaned it. He sipped his beer slowly and watched the street. There would be other cases. Some louder, some are crueler. There would be bodies, papers to sign, and magistrates to appease. But not this time. This one would not return with a gendarme or a gavel. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the letter again. He read it once more, then slipped it into his inner pocket, where it would stay. Not for the file, not for evidence, but because it belonged to someone who had spoken too late, and to someone who had finally heard. Margaret finished his beer. The sky darkened again, and somewhere down the street, a child laughed, just once, before disappearing around the corner. The weather turned overnight. By Friday morning, the air had shifted, the damp warmth of the early week giving way to something crisper, thinner, with a breeze that carried the faint scent of coal smoke and stone. It wasn't quite autumn yet, not even close. But something in the tone of the light suggested the season had begun to stir underground. Margaret rose without hurry.
He stood at the window of the flat on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, coffee cup in hand, looking down at the quiet, tree-lined avenue. The branches above the market stalls were thick with green, but a single yellow leaf turned lazily in the air, caught in a breeze too faint to feel. Behind him Madame Maigret moved about the kitchen, with her usual quiet efficiency, setting the plates, folding the dish towel, and wrapping up the last of the ham in waxed paper. It was a domestic rhythm Maigret found reassuring. No new words were needed between them. She glanced at him once and gave a half smile, which he returned with the faint lift of an eyebrow. "You'll be back for supper?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Nothing pressing today." He didn't mention Chabot, not directly, though they both knew he was still thinking about the man. They always did when a case slipped from their days into the spaces between meals. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the station felt like itself again, papers piled on desks, the radiator clanking fitfully, and the secretary in a green cardigan thumbing through the register of new arrests. Nothing urgent. A theft near Gare de l'Est, a suspected domestic quarrel gone sour in the 18th. A car was stolen and recovered within 2 blocks of where it had vanished. Maigret glanced over the reports, initialed what needed signing, and then set them aside. He spent the morning sorting through older files, half-forgotten inquiries, and letters from small towns with questions about uncles and debts and dogs that disappeared in the night. The rhythm of the work soothed him. He had never cared much for dramatic cases. It was the quiet ones that revealed people more fully. By midday he stepped out for lunch. Nothing elaborate, just a charcuterie plate, and a glass of red wine at a brasserie near Rue St. The waiter knew him by now, and didn't ask questions. Maigret ate slowly, reading the headlines. There was a minister's speech, a football match gone poorly, and an artist found dead in a studio in Montparnasse. He turned the page without lingering. He thought again of the letter in his coat pocket, the one signed only with an R. He had reread it twice the night before, not to uncover something new but to be reminded of something he already knew, that guilt is not a fire, but a fog. It doesn't burn. It surrounds, lingers, and follows you into sleep and into waking, soft but unrelenting. Around 2 o'clock, he took a detour, not official, not noted in any record, to Rue St. The street was much as he had left it. It always would be. Laundry fluttered faintly on a wire. The boy with the stone was gone, replaced by a woman leading a terrier that pulled eagerly toward the curb. A man with an accordion passed near the corner, playing a half-hearted tune that never resolved into a melody. Maigret didn't go into number 36. He didn't need to. The story there had ended not with a final chapter, but with a pause. Enough had been said. Enough had been left unsaid. Instead he stepped into the cafe once more. The same woman stood behind the counter, drying her hands. Her expression was not exactly warm, but it was familiar now. She brought him a beer without asking. He took his usual place by the window. After a moment, she spoke. "He's not coming back, is he?" Maigret looked up. "No," she nodded, eyes downcast. She leaned on the counter, towel in hand, but said no more. Maigret sipped his drink.
Mit all den alten Gewohnheiten. Sie haben mir einmal erzählt, als Sie im King's Hospital gearbeitet haben, konnten Sie allein an der Bügelfalte in der Hose eines Patienten erkennen, welches Bein bevorzugt. Miss Hartnell wurde blass. Das ist Jahre her. An die Hälfte meiner Worte kann ich mich nicht mehr erinnern. Miss Marples Ton blieb sanft. Aber vielleicht sind die Schuhe gar nicht so wichtig. Vielleicht ist es die Art, wie der Mann an der Wand lehnte. Die Steifheit seines Rückens. Die Art, wie den Hals hielt. Miss Hartnell umklammerte ihre Teetasse. Ich weiß nicht, was Sie damit sagen wollen. nur dass Sie etwas Vertrautes gesehen haben. Etwas Medizinisches, etwas aus vergangener Zeit. Sie sagten selbst, Sie hätten eine Zeit lang im Ausland gearbeitet. Es entstand eine lange Pause, dann seufzte Miss Hartnell. Es war nach dem Krieg. Ich nahm eine Stelle in einer Flüchtlingsklinik in Plovdiv an, Bulgarien. Es war vorübergehend. Ich kam innerhalb eines Jahres zurück. Haben Sie einen Mann behandelt, der aussah wie der im Obstgarten? Hartnell sagte zunächst nichts, dann nickte sie einmal. Er kam mit einer Rückenverletzung herein. Autounfall, sagte er, aber er hatte blaue Flecken, die nicht dazu passten. Jemand hatte ihn geschlagen. Er nannte sich Peter Volkow, aber ich habe nie geglaubt, dass das sein richtiger Name war. Miss Marple beugte sich vor. Der Mann war Ihnen also nicht unbekannt. Nicht ganz. Miss Hartnell schaute weg. Ich wollte nichts sagen. Nicht der Polizei. Was, wenn ich mich geirrt habe? Was, wenn er es nicht war? Miss Marple erhob sich mit freundlichem Gesichtsausdruck. Das ist verständlich, meine Liebe. Aber jetzt zählt jede Spur. Auch die losen. Wieder zu Hause öffnete Miss Marple ein kleines Notizbuch, das sie zwischen ihrem Atlas und der Familienbibel aufbewahrte. Sie schrieb 2 Namen nebeneinander auf: Peter Volkow, Cyril Halberton. Es gab noch keinen Beweis für eine Verbindung. Aber beide Männer hatten Gründe, ihre Vergangenheit zu verbergen. Und jemand hatte gewusst, dass der Tote auftauchen würde. Jemand hatte eine Geschichte vorbereitet, einen Pass, einen Schauplatz und am belastendsten Zeugen, die ihn erkennen, aber zögern würden zu sprechen. In einem Dorf wie St. Mary Mead enthüllten sich Geheimnisse nicht immer mit einem Knall. Oft kamen sie in Bruchstücken in die Wände gesteckte Briefe, ungleichmäßig abgetragene Schuhe und Umschläge, die längst zu Staub hätten werden sollen. Aber Miss Marple hatte nie Fanfare gebraucht. Sie brauchte nur Geduld, weil jedes Detail, wie versteckt auch, einen Platz hatte. Und sie kam näher zu und sah, wohin dieser wirklich gehörte. Es war eine Art Julitag, der vorgab, ruhiges Sonnenlicht sanft durch Spitzenvorhänge zu filtern, Vögel durch Hecken zu flattern und die entfernte Drohne der Bienen zwischen Fingerhut. Aber unter dieser Ruhe hatte sich etwas verändert. Die Puzzleteile waren nicht mehr zufällig verstreut. Sie hatten begonnen, schwache Grenzen von Motiv, Anerkennung und Täuschung zu zeigen. Miss Marple, die früher als gewöhnlich aufstieg, legte eine Notiz in ihre Handtasche und machte sich auf den Weg nach Willowmere House. Die Kies zerdrückte unter den Füßen, als sie von der Haushälterin begrüßt wurde, eine Frau mit einem unlesbaren Gesicht, das einst für den Richter in Market Harborough gearbeitet hatte. »Fräulein Halberton ist im Konservatorium«, sagte die Frau ohne Ausdruck. Lucinda, gerahmt von einer Wand aus Ivy und Topfern, sah älter aus als vor einer Woche. Ihr üblicher Hautton wurde gedimmt und durch eine Art misstrauischer Zurückhaltung ersetzt. »Jane«, sagte sie, »komm rein. Ich wünschte, die Leute würden aufhören, mit weiteren Fragen zu kommen. Der Inspektor war erst gestern hier. Ich werde nicht lange bleiben«, sagte Miss Marple sanft. »Ich wollte nur etwas zurückgeben.« Sie reichte Lucinda den Umschlag, den sie in der Obstgartenwand gefunden hatte. Lucinda blinzelte, als sie es öffnete, ihr Gesicht zuckte auf diese unverkennbare Weise, die die Anerkennung schlecht versteckt machte. »Woher hast du das?« Es wurde hinter den Steinen auf dem Weg versteckt, auf dem der Körper gefunden wurde. Lucinda sagte nichts. »Ich weiß, dass das schwierig ist«, Miss Marple fuhr leise fort, »aber ich denke, Sie kannten den Mann, Lucinda. Nicht vor kurzem, vielleicht nicht gut, aber genug, um etwas in ihm zu erkennen. Vielleicht eine Erinnerung, ein Brief, eine Warnung.« Lucinda wandte sich ab und starrte in den Garten, in dem sich die Lilien immer noch weigerten zu blühen. »Sein Name war nicht in der Zeitung, oder? Derjenige, der gestorben ist?« »Nein, nur der falsche auf dem Reisepass. Aber ich glaube, sein richtiger Name war möglicherweise durch Cyril mit Ihnen verbunden.«
Lucindas Schultern versteiften sich. »Du solltest meinen Bruder fragen. Ich habe vor«, Miss Marple sagte leise. »Aber Sie sind derjenige, der das Mittagessen veranstaltete. Sie sind derjenige, der nicht überrascht aussah, aber vorbereitet ist.« Lucinda packte den Umschlag. »Wenn ich sage, ich habe vermutet, wer er war, wenn ich das sage, macht es mich zu einem Lügner, weil ich es nicht früher zugegeben habe.« »Kein Lügner«, sagte Miss Marple, aber vielleicht befürchtete jemand, dass ein altes Geheimnis locker erschüttert werden könnte. Lucinda atmete aus. Vor Jahren war Cyril in ein schreckliches Geschäft mit einem Mann aus dem Kontinent verwickelt. Investitionen, oder so behauptete er. Aber es stellte sich heraus, dass der Mantes Volkow oder wer auch immer er wirklich Verbindungen zu etwas Schlimmerem hatte. Politischer Schmuggel, falsche Identitäten. Ich bat Cyril, die Verbindung abzubrechen. Ich dachte, er hätte es getan, aber er hatte nicht. »Nein«, flüsterte sie. »Ich glaube, er blieb in Kontakt. Ich glaube, er hat Geld geschickt. Und ich glaube, dass der Mann gekommen ist, um etwas zu sammeln, ob Bezahlung oder Stille.« Miss Marple saß einen Moment schweigend und ließ die Worte sich niederlassen. »Und Mr. Langham?« fragte sie. »Was ist mit ihm?« Lucinda blinzelte. »Was ist mit ihm? Haben Sie bemerkt, wie wenig er reagiert hat, als Sie an diesem Nachmittag ohnmächtig wurden? Er sah besorgt aus, aber nicht überrascht, als hätte er seinen Teil einstudiert.« Lucinda runzelte die Stirn. »Ich dachte, er wäre nur fern, höflich, unvergesslich.« »Genau«, sagte Miss Marple. »Aber ich vermute, er ist eher mehr, als er erscheint. Und nicht mit Mr. Volkows Vergangenheit verbunden.« An diesem Nachmittag forderte Miss Marple die Erlaubnis des Pfarrers auf, die Pfarrhalle für eine kurze Versammlung unter dem Vorwand zu nutzen, Spenden Sie den für das Kirchendach zu sammeln. Es war ein kluger Trick. Niemand in St. Mary Mead konnte dem Hauch eines möglichen Dramas widerstehen, der in den Gottesdienst eingewickelt war. Bis zu Teartime hatten sich mehrere Dorfbewohner versammelt. Frau Edgecombe war bestrebt nach Klatsch, Fräulein Hartnell, sichtlich unangenehm, Cyril Halberton, zu fest in seinem Blazer geknöpft, und nach ein paar Minuten Verzögerung, pünktlich wie immer, mit einem Notizblock unter seinem Arm. »Vielen Dank an alle, die gekommen sind.« Miss Marple begann sanft und stand in der Nähe des Fensters. »Ich weiß, dass unser kleines Dorf in der vergangenen Woche seinen Anteil an Unbehagen gesehen hat, und ich dachte, es könnte uns gut tun, um ein paar Dinge zu klären.« Es gab höfliche Murmeln, Tassen gegen Untertassen gekläut. »Viele von Ihnen haben gefragt«, sie fuhr fort, »über den Mann, der in Willowmere House gestorben ist. Seine Anwesenheit war erschütternd. Aber ich glaube, sein Tod war kein zufälliges Ereignis. Ich glaube, er ist absichtlich hierher gekommen, mit einem Zweck, der das Leben von mehr als einer Person in diesem Raum überschnitten hat.« Eine Stille setzte sich schwer und werdend. »Ich habe mit Miss Hartnell gesprochen«, sagte sie leise, »die bestätigt habe, dass sie den Verstorbenen als Patient aus ihrer Zeit im Ausland erkannt hat. Und Miss Halberton hat zugegeben, Korrespondenz aus derselben Region erhalten zu haben, obwohl sie sagt, dass sie den Namen des Mannes nicht kannte.« Lucinda sah auf ihren Schoß hinunter. »Und da ist Mr. Langham, Miss Marple, der sich leicht dreht, dessen Ankunft nur wenige Tage vor dem Mord ging, deren Beruf mit Migration beinhaltet und deren Gewohnheiten Vorsicht deuten. Handschuhe im Garten, Gespräche vermeiden, mehr als sprechen.« Langham räusperte sich. »Beschuldigst du mich, Miss Marple?« »Nicht beschuldigte«, sagte sie leise. »Ich frage mich nur, warum jemand ohne frühere Beziehungen zu diesem Dorf ein Haus mit bekannten Links zu einem früheren Mieter mieten würde, der in fragwürdigen Geschäften beteiligt ist.« Langhams Stirn runzelte. »Ich bin zum Frieden hierher gekommen. Das ist alles. Niemand kommt jemals zum Frieden zu St. Mary Mead«, sagte Miss Marple sanft. »Sie kommen hierher für die Illusion der Sicherheit. sich verstecken oder zu beobachten. Es gab eine lange Pause, dann stand Cyril Halberton, seine Stimme niedrig und angespannt. Was schlagen Sie vor? Dieser Langham ist ein Spion, dass ich an Mord beteiligt bin. Ich schlage vor, Miss Marple sagte ruhig, dass der Mann, der gestorben ist, hierher gekommen ist, um jemanden zu konfrontieren. Vielleicht hat jemand, der ihm schuldete, oder jemand, der ihn verraten hatte. Aber ich glaube nicht, dass der Mord geplant war, bis diese Konfrontation zu weit ging. Der Raum stillte sich. Vielleicht drohte er die Exposition. Oder vielleicht brachte er etwas, Dokumente, Briefe, Beweise, die jemanden erschreckten. Langhams Gesicht war blass geworden. Ich habe ihn nicht getötet, sagte er abrupt. Miss Marples Augen verengten sich. Dann geben Sie zu, dass Sie ihn kannten. Langham öffnete den Mund, dann habe ich es geschlossen. Cyril trat zurück, seine Augen verengten sich. Sie haben also zusammengearbeitet. Nein, sagte Langham kalt. Ich wurde geschickt, um ihn zu finden. Er war verschwunden, nachdem ein Deal in Bukarest schiefgelaufen war. Er hatte Feinde. Ich sollte ihn lokalisieren. Melden Sie zurück. Und stattdessen sagte Miss Marple leise. Sie fanden ihn tot in einem Obstgarten. Langham schluckte. Ich hatte nichts damit zu tun. Ich schwöre. Das Treffen verteilte sich kurz darauf, alle gingen unter einem Dunst der Verwirrung, Neugier und streng erfasste Stille. Miss Marple stand zuletzt und beobachtete die leeren Stühle. Geheimnisse waren an die Oberfläche gekommen, aber noch nicht die Wahrheit. Trotzdem bildete sich die Form davon. Eine Schuld, ein Verrat, und jemand versteckt sich noch jetzt hinter der Stille. Sie trat mit geschlossenem Schal in die Dämmerung. Der nächste Schritt, wusste sie, würde nicht mehr Fakten sammeln. Es würde drücken, wo es weh tat. Und beobachten, wer zuckte. Das Dorf St. Mary Neat erwachte am nächsten Morgen zu einer neuen gemurmelten Stille, die sich eng um jede Haustür, jeden Hecken und jeden klammernden Löffel Marmelade wickelte. Die Versammlung in der Pfarrhalle hatte mehr als Unbehagen zurückgelassen. Es hatte etwas Tieferes gerührt. Das Furnier der höflichen Abteilung hatte sich verdünnt, und damit war der erste wahre Skandalduft. Miss Marple stieg jedoch mit ihrer üblichen Ruhe auf. Sie frühstück auf Brei und Toast mit Damson Jam und las die Wettervorhersage, die Regen versprach, die niemals kommen würde. Ihre Gedanken blieben jedoch mehrere Schritte vor dem Wetter. Sie waren mit einer beunruhigenden Frage besetzt. Warum, wenn Langham gekommen wäre, um den Toten zu finden, war er dann geschwiegen, nachdem die Leiche entdeckt worden war? Sie steckte ihr Notizbuch und einen kleinen Umschlag in ihre Handtasche und ging zur High Street, wobei sie zuerst bei der Post hielt. Mr. Sims begrüßte sie mit seiner üblichen Kombination aus Ehrerbietung und Verdacht, dass er Miss Marple sowohl seinen Lieblingskunden als auch als sein am unvorhersehbarsten betrachtete. »Schöner Tag, Miss Marple«, sagte er, und arrangierte ein Regal aus Blottingpapier. »Ganz«, antwortete sie. »Ich fragte mich, ob ich Sie für das Register ausgehende Telegramme ab dem letzten Donnerstag beunruhigen könnte.« Er blinzelte. »Normalerweise ist das privat, Miss Marple.« »Ja, ich verstehe«, sagte sie mit einem sanften Lächeln. »Aber ich glaube, jemand hat an diesem Tag eine Nachricht gesendet, die etwas sehr Ernstes klarstellen kann. Tatsächlich ein Mord.« Seine Finger zögerten im Regal. »Ich nehme an, es würde nicht nur schaden, nur zu schauen.« Sie wartete geduldig, als er das Logbuch durchblätterte. Seine Stirn runzelte. »Hier sind wir.« Ein Telegramm schickte Donnerstagnachmittag, von Miss Vranek, an eine Adresse in Genf gesendet. Ungewöhnlicher Code. Es sagt nur, es ist getan. Kontakt getrennt. Miss Marple nickte langsam. Darf ich es kopieren? Kurs. Sie tat dies vorsichtig, dankte ihm und kehrte zu ihrem Weg zurück und ging diesmal in Richtung Mill Row und dem Unterkunftshaus. Fräulein Vranek war seit der Versammlung der Pfarrhalle nicht mehr in den Geschäften gesehen worden. Mrs. Featherstone, die Vermieterin, traf Miss Marple am Tor und vozierte ihre Hände mit sichtbaren Sorge. »Sie ist weg«, sagte sie sofort. »In der Nacht verschwunden, ließ den Raum bezahlt und ordentlich. Kein Hinweis, kein Koffer, nur der Mantelständer warf und der Riegel ließ offen. Gab es etwas im Abfallbehälter?« fragte Miss Marple sanft. Die Vermieterin runzelte die Stirn. »Nein, außer einer zerrissenen Zugkarte.« Paddington nach Dover. Miss Marple dankte ihr und ging. Die Beweise wurden stärker, aber nicht undurchsichtiger. Vielmehr war es wie ein Schal, der sich aus seinem Netz enträtselte, dass jeder lose Faden das Muster enthüllte, das versteckt war. Sie kehrte gerade nach Hause zurück, als das erste Rupiengeschwür schließlich ankam, und Oberst Melchett auf ihre Veranda, den Hut in der Hand und den Mantel an den Schultern wartete. »Jane«, sagte er, war eindeutig beunruhigt. »Ich hatte gerade einen Anruf von Inspektor Roper. Es gab eine weitere Entwicklung.«
The cafe was nearly empty, with only an old man at the far end reading the racing form through thick glasses. The room smelled of coffee grounds and faint vinegar from a jar of pickled onions behind the bar. He sat there a long time, watching the window. Nothing dramatic unfolded. A girl on a bicycle passed. A man in a cap bought cigarettes from the tobacco next door. Someone knocked at the wrong apartment and was gently redirected. And then, just as he was about to finish his beer, the bell above the door jingled. A young man entered, well-dressed, too warm for the day, with a hat held respectfully in both hands. His eyes scanned the room, uncertain. Then he stepped toward the bar. "I'm looking for a Madame Fèvre," he said quietly. Maigret turned slightly in his seat. The barmaid pointed toward number 36. "Across the street, second floor. You'll have to ring." The young man nodded, thanked her, and made to leave. Maigret watched him for a moment, watching the way he hesitated at the door, as if something pressed against him from within, some uncertainty not yet named. Then the man pushed the door open and stepped back into the street. From his seat, Maigret watched him cross, stand at the threshold of number 36, look up at the window, and finally press the bell. The door opened, a moment passed, then the man stepped inside. Maigret turned back to his beer. He didn't know the young man's name. It didn't matter, whether it was a relation, a friend of Paul Chabot, or someone entirely unconnected, drawn in by a thread he himself didn't fully understand. The presence was enough. Someone had come back. Someone had chosen to knock, to ask, and that mattered, in its way. He left a few francs on the table and stepped out into the street once more. He passed number 36 without looking up. He did not pause. His coat flapped gently in the afternoon breeze, and his pipe remained unlit in his coat pocket. He walked not toward his office, but toward the Seine. At Pont Louis-Philippe, he stood a while, hands in his pockets, watching the water move slowly beneath the stone arches. Barges slid past with low motors and distant voices. The sun broke through the clouds just enough to catch the glint of the river's surface. People passed behind him, couples, clerks, students with satchels, none of them paying him any mind. He was simply another man, looking at the water, thinking about things no one else could see, and that suited him. There were still questions he couldn't answer. What exactly Chabot had done, or failed to do, all those years ago, who had suffered, quietly and unseen, whether the letter had truly absolved him of anything. But he had listened, and maybe that, in the end, was enough. It began again just before nightfall. The rain returned not with drama or thunder, but with a soft whisper on the rooftops, a patient tapping on awnings, and a sheen spreading slowly across the sidewalks, like the city itself had exhaled. It was the same rain that had come and gone all week, never violent, never absent, only retreating far enough to be forgotten, then returning to remind Paris of its constancy. Maigret stepped out of the brasserie on Rue de France Bourgeois, where he had dined alone. He stood under the canopy for a moment, listening to the rain before turning up the collar of his coat and setting off toward home. The streets glowed under the lamps, their surfaces wet and gleaming like varnished wood. His footsteps were slow, not tired, but thoughtful. Around him, the city moved on, umbrellas unfolded, shopkeepers hurried to pull in displays, and cafe chairs were stacked and covered. It was, as always, a city adjusting to the weather without complaint. He didn't head straight to Boulevard Richard Lenoir. Instead, he took a detour through the quieter lanes of the Marais, past shuttered shops and bakeries long closed, past a familiar tobacconist's where the owner always nodded, but never spoke. He liked the silence of the old quarter at night. It reminded him of how long Paris had been here, how many lives it had seen. When he arrived home, Madame Maigret was already in her night clothes, sitting in the armchair near the window, with a book open, but unread on her lap. She looked up as he entered, offering the same half-smile she always gave when he came in late, but untroubled. "You've eaten?" she asked. "Yes, at that place near the archives, still no good." She nodded, and stood, smoothing the front of her robe. "I left your slippers out, the papers on the table, nothing of interest." He changed into his house clothes, took the seat opposite hers, and accepted the cup of warm tea she handed him. No questions, no summaries, only warmth and quiet. It was the kind of end to a day Maigret had always appreciated, not with revelations, not with resolutions, but with something settled. After a few minutes, she returned to her book. He sipped the tea slowly, letting his thoughts trail back to Rue St. Laurent, not in sharp flashes, but in muted impressions. The narrow stairwell, the smell of the boarding house, the hesitant voice of Madame Fèvre, the softness of Paul's phone call, and above all, the shape of René Chabot's absence. The space he had left behind was not dramatic. It was small, almost indistinct, like a chair no longer occupied, or a light left off. Maigret took the letter from his coat pocket, one last time. He didn't read it again. He didn't need to. He simply looked at its weight, its simplicity, and the slight curl at one corner where it had been folded too long. Then he stood, crossed to the small wooden cabinet by the door, and opened the drawer where he kept certain things not official, not part of any investigation. He placed the letter inside, between an old photograph and a railway ticket from years ago, and closed the drawer gently. Madame Maigret looked up but said nothing. He sat back down, pipe in hand, unlit. Outside, the rain picked up slightly, a little steadier now. It washed the window in soft streaks, distorting the yellow lights of the street lamps below into long trembling lines. "I think he wanted to be remembered," Maigret said suddenly, more to himself than to her. She looked over the top of her book. He was. He nodded. That was all. The next day, life resumed its shape. The station was full of noise again. Geneviève returned with a theft report from the 11th arrondissement. Inspector Lognon complained as always about his superiors. Someone brought pastries. Someone else lost a coat button and blamed the radiator's edge. Everything felt as it should. Maigret reviewed the morning reports with casual efficiency, made a few notations, and then called up the record for Chabot one last time. There wasn't much. A brief outline, a date of disappearance, and a note attached in pencil that read unresolved. No pursuit requested. He tapped the side of the folder twice, and then closed it. In the hallway, he ran into Dr. Pardon, who had come to deliver a routine medical form. They spoke briefly about the weather, the endless rain, and the dampness in the bones. "I hear you were looking into someone on Rue St. Laurent," Pardon said casually. "I was," Maigret replied. "And no crime, no scandal. Then what?" Maigret paused at the top of the stairs, hand on the banister. "Only a man who lived quietly, and disappeared more quietly still, but not without leaving something behind." Pardon nodded. He understood. He always had. By early afternoon,
Maigret stepped out into the street again. The clouds had broken, and a pale light drifted through like smoke. It wouldn't last. The city was never far from rain. He walked without urgency, his shoes clicking softly on the pavement. He passed a woman pushing a pram, a boy selling roses, a man standing in a doorway, lost in thought. They barely noticed him, and that suited him. He didn't return to Rue St. Laurent. There was no need. The story there was finished, not resolved in the way of files and verdicts, but completed in the way lives often are, without ceremony, but not without meaning. At a cafe near the canal, he ordered a small beer and sat at an outdoor table. The awning above him dripped faintly. He watched the water pass slowly beneath the bridge, and heard the distant sound of a bell as a cyclist passed by. He thought of Chabot then not as a mystery, but as a man who had tried, too late perhaps, to make peace with himself, who had spoken into a silence he thought would never answer, and yet, in the end, he had been heard. Maigret finished his drink. The rain returned in earnest, just as he reached for his coat. He stood and turned his collar up, his steps unhurried, as the street began to shine, once more with that familiar silver sheen. No one saw him pass, and yet, in some quiet way, his presence lingered, as did the rain.